Welcome everybody. I'm Mark Hennessy, Executive Director of the Chik-Wauk Museum and Nature Center. And we have a full crowd, and I know this about Helen Hoover fans, is that you are early arrivers. So thank you for coming. Full house in September. We'd love to see that. So good to see everybody today. We have a couple of good programs still on the way. And next week will be Eric Simula. We'll be talking about a great adventure that he took. That's next Saturday. And on this coming Monday, we'll be having a loon talk on the porch here. So join us for that. The season's winding down. We're open 7 days a week through about October 19th. Thank you. So stop in and visit anytime. We've got some good specials in our gift shop, and we love to have visitors right till the very end. This presentation is, as always, supported by great donors, individual donors, and also Visit Cook County. So we're super grateful that we're able to offer programs all summer. With that, I will introduce our author today, and I'm going to do a shameless plug for his book. We have them for sale, and he'll sign them after we're done. David Hakensen is a author of Note, written for many magazines, but I believe this is your first book, and was a former president of the Minnesota Historical Society. So that's a big gig, of course. That's a big operation. So we're really glad to have you here, and we'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Mark. Boy, this is a huge turnout. I'm really surprised. So, not surprised, but flattered and glad that you're all here. I'm going to try to stay in this space here. Can everybody hear me in the back? Because we didn't mic me because it gets to be very boomy. So, that's good. Excellent. So, I've done one talk so far. I did it at UMD on Thursday. And, of course, when I asked people in the room, has anybody heard of Helen Hoover? It was like one or two hands that went up. And so if I ask that question here, I'm sure every hand's going to go up, right? So, okay. So how many people know about Helen Hoover, read her books, or just that? Let me ask that question first. How many know or have read her books? Okay. And then the rest of you are just here because you're curious, right?
Yep.
So, excellent. All right. Well, I'm quite excited to talk about this book. I was here 6 years ago after I had done a magazine article for Minnesota History, and I talked about what I knew at that point. And then in 2020, University of Minnesota Press called me one day, and they said, "Hey, I hear you're working on a biography on Helen Hoover." And of course, I've been telling people that for years, but I didn't have a publisher, and I wasn't going to self-publish. Because I wanted to be a real biography and not something that I had to try to figure out how to get published. So we came to an agreement right before COVID, and I started working on it right then, and I finished the final draft in 2024, and it's taken this long for it to get published. So that's a whole other story about how long it takes to get published. But so I really did take a deep dive on all of her background. I talked to many people up here who knew Helen, like Charlene Letourneau. I met her very early on in my research. I talked to John Henriksen and his wife Julie before they passed away. I was able to see the original summer cabin that Artie and Carol Byers owned, and then they had to tear it down and build something else because that was falling in on itself. And so, and then I did a lot of work at UMD, which is where Helen's papers were eventually donated after she passed away. They kind of had a circuitous route. They went from Laramie, Wyoming, and then they went to Ohio University. Was supposed to get them because Helen went there for 2 years, and they said, "No, we don't want her papers because nobody that wants to research her history as a nature writer will think to come to Ohio looking for her." So they sent them to the University of Minnesota in Minneapolis, and they said, "No, we don't want them here. We're going to send them to Duluth," because at that time there was a place called the Northeastern Minnesota History Center, which was it's it's still there physically. It's not there in name, but it's still there physically, all the papers, and that's who's got the papers. And they sat there for most of probably 10 years before one person, and I'll talk about her later, started to do some research on her, and then nobody since I came along in 2008. So there's only been 2 people that have really dove into it. There's 23 boxes of stuff, and when I say stuff, I mean stuff. I mean all sorts of stuff. Papers, but other things too. So it was quite a lot to go through to kind of sift through and organize and do a lot of research. As many people have said about this book, it was well researched, and it's because there was so much to go through, and not only in Duluth but in other places around the country where there are papers that are related to her through people she knew. So it's been like putting together a jigsaw puzzle, and it came together pretty well at the end. So without that preamble, I haven't given everybody because there's not as many people that want to know the backstory. But that we'll jump in and start to talk about Helen and her life. So, who is she for those who don't know and that just came here out of curiosity? She was a very popular nature writer in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s when she lived here in Gunflint Lake. She moved here with her husband Adrian in 1954 to a cabin over on the south side of the lake, and they had no experience living in the woods. They had owned the cabin since 1948, but they had not lived here in the wintertime. They had come here every summer for 2 weeks and fixed the cabin up and did those things. And she wrote 4 best-selling books for adults and 3 for children. So, and we'll talk about some of the other writing she did later, because I think there's some misperceptions about the type of writing she did over the years. So people ask, why did you write this book and why now? And I think it's because Helen is still relevant. I think she's her writing is timeless, and most nature writing is timeless. When you think about it, we still read Thoreau and Walden, and that was a long time ago. So I think history writing is interesting in that people that observe nature and write about it, nature doesn't change. It's just how they write about nature. So books never really go out of style or out of fashion. Maybe the language does, but the idea of writing about nature and connecting with nature and how man interacts with nature, that doesn't change. So those things make her still relevant today. I think the thing that got missed over the years about Helen is that she was a very successful metallurgist, and we'll talk about that shortly, before she ever came up here to be a writer. And I think part of the resilience of being a woman in a man's profession in her earlier years, and then later the perseverance that she and her husband endured up here, really made it an interesting story. And this whole metallurgy part of her life is fascinating, and we'll dive into that as well. So here she is. Here's her high school graduation picture. And I'm sorry, you guys, I'm blocking your view. So, born in Greenfield, Ohio in 1910. Her parents, look at that, they were older. She did have an older brother who died only a couple of weeks after he was born, and that was several years, in 1908, I believe. Her father was a factory manager in a large factory in Greenfield. Her mother was very religious and very Victorian. And because her father's position at that manufacturing plant, they were sort of like, they were members of a country club. They lived in a very nice house. They did have somebody come in and prepare meals. So they were part of the hoi polloi of Greenfield, Ohio. And at that time, it was a pretty bustling community. It isn't so much anymore, but back then it was. So her father really doted on her. He probably, both of them did to a degree, but her father more so probably because the first son had passed away. And then her mother was, because she was a daughter, and she was very Victorian in her views, was very strict about what Helen did and who she dated and where she was, and kept her on a short leash. Therefore, Helen did things like play the piano and do ballet and do all the things that young girls did in the teens in the last century. So after high school, she went off to college at Ohio University, where she got to enjoy a little bit of independence. And of course, she went to college in the 1920s, so it was the flapper era. So young women were really starting to show their independence back then, and she was swept up in all of that. So, In the summer of 28, but right after her freshman year, her father died unexpectedly. He lost all of his investments, and not in the crash of 29 like Helen has written, that's not accurate. He actually lost them in a smaller crash that happened in 1928, and during that period of the 28 and 29, there was so much stock speculation that the market was just going up and down. It was one of those earlier crashes that he lost all of his money. He got the call on the night before the 4th of July, and the next morning he was going to, on the holiday, was going to go to Cincinnati to meet with his broker, but when he woke up, he had a massive heart attack and died. Helen and her mother didn't know what to do. They never thought anything about how they were going to get along by themselves. Their father was always the provider and the one that took care of those things. So Helen, there was enough money for, the lawyer told Helen and her mother there was enough money for her to go to school for one more year, and then they'd have to sell this house and all their belongings, and they would have to figure out what to do to get some money. Helen, having now gone to college and had a little taste of independence, said, I'm going to Chicago to work. And, excuse me, I'm getting ahead of myself. So that second year of school, her mother had wanted her to be a teacher or or a secretary, which is what most people, women in those days, trained for. She wanted nothing to do with either one of those jobs. Her college advisor sort of saw very early on that Helen was very bright, smarter than most people. Today, if she was tested, she'd be considered gifted or have a high IQ. But they didn't do that back then. It was just sort of an assumption. Teachers, if they sensed that you were super smart, they would, sort of push you one way. So he said to her, you need to study sciences. You need to use your brain. You don't need to do all this other stuff, writing and English. That just comes naturally for you. You need to focus on the sciences. So she did that, but obviously if she's only going to have 2 years of college and have to drop out, it wasn't necessarily going to do her a lot of good. But we will see later that it did. So this change about her, after her father died, Helen wanted to go to Chicago to find work. She felt like she could do better there. Her mother wanted her to move in with family in Cincinnati, and Helen's mother was the oldest of about five kids, and all of them now at this stage were either widowed or never married, and they all lived in the same house in Cincinnati.
Oh wow!
So you can tell what a nightmare Helen thought that was. And I learned later on when Helen went to visit them as an adult that they truly were a nightmare. So Helen was going to Chicago, hell-bent, she was going. And her mother, being very protective, said, I'm going with you just to make sure you don't get into trouble. So they did. They took the train to Chicago and they got off. She talks in some places about moving into the Y for a couple of days because they couldn't afford anything else. I actually, in my research, learned the Y had closed a year before. So she's misremembering where they stayed. But point is, they stayed in a series of flop houses and bad apartments that were furnished because they couldn't afford anything else. So Helen finds a job at a mail order house, and this is an interesting story that's talked about in the book. Being smart and being industrious, she really came, worked hard, and showed up the rest of the people who were just kind of getting by. So she didn't make any friends among her coworkers. They thought she was like a go-getter, and they didn't like that. So she had difficulty getting along with people in those early years because she was there to do a job, and the rest of them were just kind of like, and despite the fact that this was the Depression.
Right.
So just talk about that, the challenges of the Depression. She found a new job proofreading, something that suited her sensibilities better. It was with a company called the Audit Bureau of Collections, and that is still a company, and they did a lot of proofreading work, and it was really suited her well because she was attention to detail, very smart, and they liked her because she could read lots of material quickly, and she was very successful at that. She met a guy named Adrian, who was her future husband, on a blind date. He was a guy that was just sort of a fixed cars, worked in a meatpacking plant. He did pick-me-up jobs. Again, this was the Depression. He couldn't find a lot of work. He wanted to be an artist. And Helen told him he should take on jobs where he didn't get paid just to get experience. So he did things for newspapers and telephone books and things like that just to use his art skills and start to develop them. They got engaged in 1931 at a state park called White Pine State Forest. It's in Illinois. It's about, I would say, 100 miles due west of Chicago. Has anybody ever been there by any chance? Well, it's interesting. I understand it is the last stand of first growth, old growth, white pine in the United States that far south. So, and it is, I've been there. I went there because I wanted to see what this was all about since it was still around. It's beautiful. I mean, you feel like you're it reminded me of the pines that are at Itasca State Park. It's that sort of, and it's weird because it's like in the middle of farmland in Illinois. So you're driving along and you go, okay, where are these trees going to be? This is like all rolling fields, and all of a sudden there it is. So it's a beautiful place. But that is where both Helen and Adrian got the bug that they wanted to live in the woods someday. I mean, you can imagine. I mean, they get engaged. They have these beautiful pines. Of course, they think they want to live in the woods someday. So that was the promise they made to each other on that day. So marriage and then mom again. So we got that. So Helen and Aid, he went by Aid. Actually, for those who have lived here a long time, he actually went by Bill. So he was, Aid was the name she gave him in the book, but she actually called him Bill. And I don't do that in the book because it's too confusing to switch back and forth. But anyway, she and Aid married in 1937. They needed to take some time in between things to get established and for Aid to get a real job and all of that. Helen lived with them. Of course, when you think about the social dynamics of the time, a lot of moms and even grandparents lived with families, couldn't afford to live on their own. They didn't have decent nursing care in those days. So there was no doubt with Helen and Hannah having lived with each other all those years that when Helen and Aid got married that she would be a part of the arrangement. So, and she was. It was not an ideal situation. They locked horns quite a bit about things from what I've been able to learn. And then these times, this is when Helen and Aid decided we needed to find a vacation home, and they started driving to look for this old growth pine. And they obviously started in Wisconsin and then the UP. Disappointed because most of that was pretty developed by then, or owned. I shouldn't say developed, but owned. And when you think about the initial North Woods fervor of people in Chicago, where were they going to go? Wisconsin, UP. And part of it too is that if anybody's heard of Sam Campbell, who was a guy that was sort of a nature, he was sort of a nature lover, wrote books for kids back in the 40s and 50s. He got hired by the Northwestern and Chicago Railroad to promote resorts in northern Wisconsin. So that's where all the Chicago people went. They took the train and they went to Rhinelander and Eagle River and Minocqua and other points and up into the UP. And so that's where everybody was looking for stuff. So they were having a hard time and they were getting very frustrated. But before they could find anything, World War II came in, and there's Aid with his little Navy uniform on, 1943. So the war starts, and Helen, what happened, for those who are students of history, everybody knows the men all went off to war, and there were all these jobs that needed to be filled, and not only for the war effort, but just regular jobs because the men were gone. Women obviously were recruited for those jobs. We all hear the story about Rosie the Riveter, and that's sort of the interesting one because it's the most unusual job that women did to support the war effort. But there was lots of other jobs that needed to be filled. And Helen, because of her background in the sciences and because of some night classes she took in biology and chemistry, she got a job at a testing lab. It was Pittsburgh testing lab. And a testing lab that she got a job at was one that would test different types of metals for their properties. So she would take a lathe. She would use a lathe and get cuttings of steel or iron or beryllium or nickel or whatever. And the customers that the lab had wanted to know which properties were strong for this and that and the other thing. And she did that work. She was learning how to use these pieces of equipment that men would have normally done all of this work. There would have never been any women working in this lab other than secretarial jobs. And she started to do this and got very adept at it, and she continued to get more and more work. She didn't just do the work, but she would think about it and offer insights and write observations and do things about the properties, and they liked what she did, and she got a series of jobs in other testing labs, each one getting, paying her better, and each one with more increasing responsibilities. I talked about Abe being in the Navy in the Pacific, and I talked about her. Here we go. There we go. So here's Helen. This is the first adult picture of Helen. This is at her desk at International Harvester. I think I got a pointer here. So you can see. Let's see if I can do this. Whoops, whoa, don't want to do that. I won't quite. But you can see cinder block wall. You can't really see from back there, but cinder block painting. This is one of those heavy industrial gray metal desks that you can see. Look at that chair, it's got chipped paint on it. The electrical plug on the outside of the cement. I mean, you can see that it's not a very sexy workplace. But this is her job, this is her desk at International Harvester. And she worked there from right after World War II until 1954. So Abe then found a job as an art director at a textbook publisher. So you remember the Alice and Jerry books? You know, the primer books when you were a kid, the reading books, Alice and Jerry, and then there was the other one. So he worked for that company, Scott Porsman in New Zealand, in Chicago. He worked there doing illustrations for those types of books. So now that it's, you know, they're both working, making money, they've got the ability to start looking for that cabin again. So again, I was telling you they had looked in Wisconsin Upper Peninsula, but at one time they went to a resort and somebody said, oh, you should be looking in Minnesota. Go to Minnesota. And they actually happened to be going on a trip to, Helen wanted to go see the open pit mines in Hibbing because, you know, she's a metallurgist. She wants to see where steel comes from. So she had always wanted to go to Hibbing. And they were going to go to Hibbing, and then they were going to take a detour and maybe go to Grand Marais, as this person said they should do. Well, they never went to Hibbing. They just kept going and went to Grand Marais, got into town, and talked to the ranger in either Tofte or Grand Marais, and said we were looking for land or property, or we want pines. That's what she said. And they said, go up the Gunflint Trail, you'll find what you're looking for up there. So they came up the trail in 1948, and I think, I have to remember, I've got so many facts up here, I got to get this right. The book the book A Place in the Woods either says they came in the fall, or it was the spring. Anyway, she had it wrong, and the book is right, and her book is wrong. But she had it all backward. But regardless, the Gunflint Lodge was closed, and if you've read her book, she relates the story of meeting going into the lodge, and somebody offers them cookies and coffee, and it's a person they think is the lodge owner. It's kind of a short man, and then she realizes when Bill Kerfoot walks in, who was her husband at the time, realizes that Justine is a woman, not a man. So, and I think it was one of the children was scurrying about, and so anyway, so that's why we know that it was Gunflint Lodge, because it's kind of, there's no names attached to it in the book. And a lot of the characters in Helen's book, as we'll talk about later, were all composites of different people. Up here, the lodge was a composite of Heston's Lodge as well as the Gunflint Lodge. So she used different things like that. So that's when she met the Kerfoots. And before I get to that next part, I have to go back to the metallurgy, because these two things are on parallel tracks. So Helen, as I mentioned, had some challenges working at International Harvester. Again, men were all coming back from the war. Helen did not go back to a job that women do. She stayed there because they wanted her to. And so she got a lot of harassment, a lot of sexism that you could imagine. She was, a lot of the men were irritated, particularly those that had college degrees or masters or even PhDs, that here she is working alongside of us and she's got 2 years of college. But she was very smart and she's very intellectual, and again was able to, show that she could keep up with everybody. She was assigned a project to fix the disc harrow breakage problem. This was a problem that had vexed International Harvester since the turn of the century. They kept, and if those of you who grew up on a farm know what I'm talking about, disc harrow is pulled behind a tractor and it tills the field. And what happens is, with rocks and clay and other types of things in the soil, the discs break. And this is a big problem for International Harvester and anybody that was making farm equipment. And if a disc breaks and enough of them break, then equipment goes down, the farmer has to fix it, that's downtime, they don't have time in the field. It has a huge bottom line impact on a farmer. So they had been trying to figure this problem out. It was a problem with the steel. They couldn't figure out what it was. I talk about it in the book because I had to go to school on it. I'm not real good at explaining the scientific part of it. But the long and short of it is that it was about the heat treating of the steel itself when it was being made. And she solved this problem. She had pulled in experts from people that she had met in the field and talked to them, and had gotten some research from France and some research that the US Navy was doing after World War II about steel breakage on ships. So she put all of this together, did a 2-year project of her own testing, and she solved the problem. The problem was like a salt water cooling that made the steel strong, but it didn't break as easily as it did. So she solves that problem and she gets a patent for it. And of course now she's a hero at International Harvester. And I will tell you, I didn't read this anywhere, but my speculation is, having read so much research on her, I think they gave her the project so that she would fail and then they could fire her.
Wow.
And she did. She solved it. And in fact, I got the feeling of that. She wrote 2 articles about this after she moved up here for magazines, for business and metallurgy magazines and they weren't factual, they were like case study type things, so there's no names in them, but it's all about International Harvester and this project. And she tried to sell them to magazines to make some money, and nobody would take them. But I've read them, and they're very interesting because they give you a fictionalized account of this whole process that she went through and all the harassment that she endured. So that was really helpful in telling that part of the story in the book. So now we can go back to the woods. Thanks for that little interlude there. So they, as I said, they came up here after they met Justine. Justine sent them down the road to this cabin, and the guy was there, and he sold it to them on impulse on that day or the next day. They thought about it overnight. They drove back to Grand Marais and stayed in some motel there, and then they called them the next day and they said, "We'll buy it." So they didn't know what they were buying. It was not a good cabin. And they realized that there was water coming through the basement. It was, it's still the cabin is there, but the ground around it is very, there's a spring that runs through there. So it's very, you can see why that was not situated in the best place. They would come from 48 to 53 in the summer to fix the cabin and work on it for like 2 weeks for their 2-week vacation. One of the resort owners, I don't know if this was your dad or if it was somebody else, that said, "You know, the cabin next door is for sale, and you two, all you do is come up here and work the whole time. Why don't you buy this other cabin, which is a good deal, and you could like stay there and enjoy that one while you work on this one because you're not having any fun." So they did. They bought the cabin. It was the Morrissey cabin, for those of you who have been here a long time. It was a summer-only cabin. So that's where Helen called that the summer cabin in her books. And the log cabin was the winter cabin, because the winter cabin was the one they lived in most of the time. So they've got the cabin now. They thought Gunflint Lake was beautiful, and as you went farther east, there hadn't been in those days. It hadn't been cut down as much, so there was more of this sort of virgin, old-growth pine that she was looking for. So that's really what I think made their decision more than the cabin itself. I think they were just they were sort of bedazzled by the setting, and they just said, "We got to buy it." And I think they were probably at the point where if we don't buy now, we're not going to ever. So they made the move. So here's how they did this, and I wish I could build my slides. I haven't figured that out because I'm giving away some of my story. But Abe had surgery in Chicago, and he was really slow to recover. And if you remember anything about 1950s Chicago, it was very polluted, air pollution, terrible. We just didn't have the concern about the environment that we do now. So she said, "I'm going to the cabin. I'm going to try to get 2 months off from International Harvester to convalesce at the cabin and get him back to shape." They did. They let her do that. Probably she had a little bit of leverage on the project that she had just finished. And then when they were driving back to Chicago, long faces, we don't want to go. It's been the best 2 months of our lives. And they're driving down the trail, and Helen convinces Abe that they should quit their jobs and move to the cabin full time. And she gets to Grand Marais, and she goes to the phone exchange and calls her boss and says, "I quit." And then they keep going on to Chicago to pack up their goods, and they literally packed everything up, including the phone book and stuff like that, and had it shipped up here in a big semi truck, which that was a joke all by itself. And I talked a little bit about that in the book. But you can imagine the South Gunflint Lake Road was about a third as wide as it is today. And I've seen pictures with the overgrowth in there. Can you see a semi truck coming up there? And then the house that they had was on where the auto port still is, at the old buyer's place. That was where the truck was pointed up the hill, and all the stuff came out the back and right into the auto port. And then Helen and Aid unpacked stuff in the summer house and in the winter house, and a baby grand piano.
Oh my!
I know. They were pack rats. Anyway, so you have these challenges of this cabin that they are going to live in. Again, they've only spent summers here, so going down to the lake to get a bucket of water, not a big deal. No electricity for 2 weeks, we can deal with that. They did not understand that they would be living in this cabin all winter long. It's not well insulated. Yeah, no running water, no electricity, an outhouse. They had a cook stove. They had this oil furnace that was kind of wishy-washy. And that was it. And I know folks were very concerned about whether they were going to make it through the winter or not, because people just kind of shook their heads and go, I don't know if these two knew what they signed up for. So, and being, outsiders from Chicago, although that is and isn't an issue. There's a lot of former Chicago folks up here. I mean, the Hestons were from Chicago, and there were other resort owners that have owned cabins up and down the trail here that were from Chicago. So, but I think being, children of the Depression, and bootstrapping yourself, you don't ask people for help. You just figure it out. They were reluctant to seek a lot of help. It wasn't to say people didn't offer, because they did. I know that some of the resort owners. I know Bill Kerfoot sold them an outboard motor because they had a boat that went with the cabin. I think they bought a chainsaw from Merle, secondhand one, so they could cut firewood. I wasn't able to get the provenance of that, but people did help them out by doing some of that. Neither one of them hunted or fished. Again, that's a little unusual, because if you live up here, that's an important way to put food on the table. And more so, Helen was opposed to hunting on moral grounds. She just didn't like it. So, and of course, the nearest grocery store is 45 miles away, although they were able to buy groceries at the resort stores, but you don't get a whole grocery store in that experience. So in the summer they could get those things, but in the winter, that was another thing. They also had to make a living. Here's Aid right here. This is he's sitting at you can't really see it well, but he is sitting at a makeshift easel, sketching, and that's actually Peter the deer right there in that particular picture. That one was being drawn for, well, it's interesting, this picture was taken in 1963, and that was used in the Gift of the Deer in 1966. So Helen was actually working on that book well before 1966, and we'll get into that later. But that's Aid, and you can't really see from this picture how jammed that small cabin was with stuff. This makes it actually look like it's quite spacious, but it was not. He was going to get a contract to do artwork, and he was going to get paid $10,000 to do artwork over a period of a couple of years and mail it into this client of his. I think it was in Chicago. So he would do the artwork, whatever it was, and then mail it, and then and do this over a period of time. He was going to go to Duluth, and he was going to drive there and meet his contact and sign the papers. And it was in November of 1954. They'd been here all of 2 months. They went into town. They were picking up all their winter clothes and their blankets and their sleeping bags and some other provisions that they were going to use for the winter. And they had a head-on car accident on the Gunflint Trail. Seriously injured, but not hospital level. But Aid, his head on the dashboard. Helen's ankles and knees were all screwed up. They don't have a car. They can't fix the car. They can't afford to buy another car. And Aid misses the meeting in Duluth, and he loses the contract, and he can't. So now they really have to improvise. Helen sold some scientific journals that she had for $300, and Helen, this is where those phone books come in handy. Helen said, Aid, you could do art, you could do stationery and note paper. And she said, and we could do it with a mimeograph. And I remember she worked at this job where she worked on a mimeograph machine. So she pulls out her Chicago phone directory. She looks up, office supply dealers. Oh yeah, A.B. Dick. Okay, I know those people. And she calls them. I think she probably went to one of the resorts to use the phone. Calls them, gets connected with a dealer in Duluth. She writes him a letter and says, this is what we need. He says, I can do a used one for you and for the whatever money they had. And he shipped the mimeograph up here on the truck, and with the stencils that you use. And I think most of you know what a mimeograph is, don't you? Remember from grade school, the quizzes were, the teacher didn't. We all love the smell of that ink. That was there. See, everybody remembers. So anyway, it doesn't use electricity, so they can hand crank it. So A does the stencils. They buy paper. They do the mimeograph, and they start selling them to probably Heston's and Gunflint Lodge, and down in the gift shops. And Humphreys and Grand Marais was one of the places that sold them. And then she put an ad in Audubon magazine because she saw those magazines at the lodges, and she read those magazines at the lodges. And so they start to get mail order. So they're original mail order people. And then they put together these catalogs of stuff that you could order, all these different designs. And Helen had an uncle, one of those crazy uncles in Cincinnati. He was in the ad promotions business. So he would sell things like combs. And if you go up here in the display, the Helen Hoover display up there, you'll see this little plastic thing of 5 or 6 combs. Well, he gave them a bunch of that stuff, and then they turned around and marked it up and sold it, and through this catalog of theirs. So they were selling things like combs and rain caps, and then Helen was crocheting stuff, and then also designing patterns for people to buy that they could crochet, and then this note paper. And they had this like thick little wholesale catalog that they created, and I thought, man, these people were industrious. I mean, they were desperate to make money. And she wrote the copy for the ad, or for the catalogs, and then Aid created all the little pictures that went with it. There's a whole bunch of them in a file in Duluth, and it's just fascinating to look at. So they really eked out a living doing that for some time. But then Helen, when she saw those magazines, she said, I'm reading these stories about animals. I can do this. I know how to write. I spent years in the lab observing animals. I'm looking at them right now, and I'm enjoying the deer and the birds and all of that. I think I could do that. So she started to write, and she started to submit things like Audubon and Defenders of Wildlife News and Frontiers and Nature, and there was a lot more nature magazines back then than there are now. So, and she submitted them, and she started to get $35, $50 a throw for these things, and that led to her getting a contract to write a column for Humpty Dumpty's, which is a children's magazine, and they liked her writing so much that they gave her a monthly contract to write a nature column. And here at Chik-Wauk, in their archives, they have, whoops, that's not the one I want. They have one of these little Humpty Dumpty's. You remember these from the doctor's office or the dentist's office? Yeah. So yeah, they're fun. They're great. But anyway, she wrote a monthly column on some animal, like bluebirds or loons or whatever, and she was paid like $50 a month. So again, in the 1950s and early 60s, that's like real money. And she did that from 1958 till 1970, I think. So that's a lot of columns. She has this one chart in one of her folders. Of course, she's a scientist. Every column, every month, what subject was what she was paid. And it was just like this page after page. So it was really important for them. And of course, they continued to sell the note paper and did well with that. But of course, this magazine writing is going to lead somewhere. And but before we get there, I want to talk about Peter and the Deer family, because they came on the scene before she was writing her books, and that's important to understand. So that is a picture of Peter that Helen took out her window on the day after Christmas, 1958, because it's dated on the back. And then this is a picture of Peter a year later. He still has his horns, his antlers. That's how I'm from the cities. Antlers. He hadn't shed them yet. So in that picture over there, he had shed them. So anyway, that's sort of the basis for those who know the gift of the deer, and the fact that she fed the deer and then started to name the deer, and each season there would be a couple of new fawns that showed up, and it just kept getting bigger and bigger. And this was fascinating for her. I mean, what else are you going to do when you're living here full time, especially in the winter? And they had no television, they had intermittent radio, so they really this became sort of their entertainment among other things. And that was the deer was the focus of what I'm talking about here, but there were chipmunks and squirrels and flying squirrels and birds and all the other things that ate as well. The thing that people up here worried about is they fed the animals better than they fed themselves. Yeah. So, I mean, in the early years, I mean, later on, that didn't get to be quite the problem. And then, of course, what happened is that the hunters soon figured out the Hoovers were feeding all these deers, and that's just like manna from heaven for them. So they started to hunt on the land, even though it was marked and posted no hunting and all of that. Oh. And, it was very, and the lodge owners, of course, with all the hunters, they sent people that way. Go down to the Hoover property, you'll find plenty of deer there. So it was unfortunate. It was really, one year it was just a slaughter. I think they took 8 of the deer, and it was not good. And that put Helen at odds, not with the Hestons, but with Justine Kerfoot for sure. Because Justine was, I think, one of them who harvested some of those deer, because Helen wrote in a letter to her publisher. She said, I talked to one of my neighbor lodge owners the other day, and she thanked me for fattening up her deer. Oh. I thought, lodge owner, her deer. And I said, that's got to be Justine. Of course, Justine hunted. She was a guide, and but that's the reality of living up here. You can't feed deer and not expect people to hunt. So Helen was going to be in conflict with those that hunted, and they were harassed, and all of her books talk about that to a degree, and I talk about that as well in my book. Harassed for feeding the deer and having deer and everything that goes along with that. So that was going on in the background from about 1958 to 1962 is when Peter was shot and killed. And that was a particularly disturbing incident for Helen, because Peter was shot out of season on Gunflint Lake, like in January, and left for dead. It wasn't taken for his meat. It was just left on the ice. And those of you know who Abuch is, the Native American who worked for Justine and was a regular fixture here, is the one that told Helen that she found Peter on the ice. Mm-hmm. And Helen has never revealed who shot the deer, but she knows, because she said in a letter to her publisher, to her editor, she said, I know who the person is, and I will never tell my husband because I don't know what he would do if he knew. So I have no way of knowing who it was, but it was obviously somebody that was known to her, and it will forever be speculation, because there'll be never any way to know. Anyway, so the magazine writing leads to a book contract. She had an article on, I think, a mice family that she wrote about, that was serialized in a magazine or in a book on nature, and the publisher of that book really liked the story, and they approached her about writing a book, and that's The Long Shadowed Forest. And The Long Shadowed Forest is probably the least interesting of the 4 books that she wrote for the adult market. It's more of a guidebook, and if you pick it up, it's got chapters about insects and mammals and birds and trees and fish and all this sort of stuff. And it's a very accurate guidebook for this area. It's just a little dry, and of course it's her first book, so she's not going to hit her stride right away. But she still weaves in these interesting stories about observing animals and things like that. So you get a little bit of the later Helen Hoover in this guidebook. So, and it's but it was a reference company that published it, a company called Thomas Crowell, and they did reference books like Bartlett's quotations and things like that. So they really weren't well suited for publishing a book or promoting a book like this to the mass market. It did very well. It sold like 20,000 copies, which is like really unusual in 1963 for a nature book. I mean that's just very, very unusual. She had some great reviews. She happened to know, I can't think of his name, a well-known New York Times columnist who wrote about it on the opposite editorial page, Harrison Salisbury. St. Paul native. He knew of the Northwoods. He knew about Helen Hoover. He loved the book. He wrote about it a year after it came out, and then it had a big boost in sales. And that's when a guy named Alfred Knopf read about her, and also had read something she wrote in a magazine and sent her a letter and said, do you, by chance with your husband, have a book in you that we could publish? And of course her book had just come out and he hadn't seen it. So she sent him a note and she said, sorry, my book was just published. And he said, why didn't you, reach out to Sig Olson because you know him and we publish his books and blah, blah, blah. And so she was like, oh boy, missed the opportunity. But she still had a book. So when they wanted her to write the next book, it was going to be The Gift of the Deer. She started working on that. That was like the most important book that she was ever going to write in her life because it was important for her to tell Peter's story and to get that right and the influence and the impact that that Deer family had on them during those very difficult years. She was very frustrated. She had this way of a knack of connecting with people, that could maybe do her good at some point in the future. And there was a columnist at Family Circle magazine, sort of the Martha Stewart of her era, and I'm blanking on her name right now.
Gladys Tabor.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So Gladys Tabor said, you're too good a writer to be struggling, and I'm mad that you're having a hard time with this, and I know this book's important to you. She said, call my agent. She said, I never tell any of my writer friends to call my agent because she doesn't want, to be hounded by people. But she said, you're too good. So Helen sends this letter off to the agent is a woman named Carol Brandt. She sends a note off, says, Gladys said that I can write to you. I have this manuscript. I've been talking to a few publishers, but I'm not happy with that. And Carol Brandt writes back. She says, I'll be happy to look at the manuscript. Send it to me. At the same time, Helen had been talking because of the Alfred Knopf connection. She had sent him a letter. Unbeknownst to her, Alfred Knopf had had a massive heart attack and was in recovery for about 6 months. So the letter kind of sat around the office and they never connected until Alfred Knopf gave it to Angus Cameron, again, Sigurd Olson's author, and said, call this woman. We talked to her a few years ago. She might have something. So Angus is kind of going, yeah, whatever. I don't have time for this. Carol Brandt knows Angus. Sends a note to Angus saying, I have this manuscript from this woman named Helen Hoover. And you're going, okay, interesting. I'm going to connect the dots here. The agent read it and said, this is a great book. We're going to take it. And she sold it to Alfred Knopf like within a day or two. They took the book and they were going to publish it in 1967. One of the things that Carol Brandt, very good agent, very smart, she worked for a lot of interesting people over her career. She had sent it to Reader's Digest. And back in the 60s, for those of you who remember, Reader's Digest would do this thing called condensed books. And it'd come out 4 times a year, and they sold them, and they would take 4 bestsellers each quarter, and they would condense them. You wouldn't lose the story, but give you enough to get the gist of it. And they would package them and sell them, inexpensively. So it was a big deal for your book to get taken for Reader's Digest. They also paid well. So Helen gets this contract to do The Gift of the Deer, and Carol has sent this manuscript over to Reader's Digest to a guy she knows. She says, this kind of fits your profile of a condensed book. They call her right back and they said, we want it right now, but the deal is we have an opening in our fall of '66 and we need it now. And it had never been done before where a book was published by the publisher and Reader's Digest at the same time, because the publisher wants to have a little lag time to sell the book for real. So they published it simultaneously, and Reader's Digest paid Helen Hoover $20,000 for that. In addition to I think it was 10 that she got from Knopf. So suddenly, $30,000 when you're living in a cabin that has no running water and electricity, boy, that's real money. Actually, what happened was Abe went and bought a Mustang.
What?
He went right down to the Ford dealer and he bought a Mustang, a maroon Mustang. And they were so thrifty from the Depression, he said, I don't think we need air conditioning.
Oh.
And Helen cursed him ever since then when they spent all these years driving around Southwest and New Mexico. But anyway, so Helen now, Alfred Knopf, big, well-respected global publisher, or a big American publisher. Reader's Digest, the other thing about Reader's Digest is that they publish 10 editions in foreign languages. So, and they don't have to take the books, but they usually do. And so there's all these contracts that she has in her papers of Japanese version, Norwegian version, French, English, and all this. So each one of those paid her another round of royalties. Now, they didn't sell as well in those countries as they did in the US, but she had this steady stream of royalty income coming not only from the book, but from the Reader's Digest book. So she becomes a best-selling author. This is a great picture. I wish it was bigger. So here's a Humpty Dumpty right here, a stack of Humpty Dumptys just like that. There's a reference book there. These are all reference books along here. This is like something about insecticides. These are gas lamps. They had this LP gas lamps. I've never even heard of that before. And Helen would talk about in her letters that they leaked terribly. And I was sitting around there, well, the cabin leaked too, so there was plenty of fresh air. But you know, if it had been sealed, they probably would have died of carbon monoxide. But then she's got this little royal typewriter. That's the manual, and she's looking at a document there. She's got this is a very tight space. That's a window there that looks out onto Gunflint Lake. Her window was looking on the lake, and Aid was in the back looking up the hill. And I mean, she had books and stuff shoved all over the place, and it was just crazy. So, of course, they say we need another book, like right now. And of course, you know, she spent years writing The Gift of the Deer, or several years. So what happened here is that, unbeknownst to when I was doing my research, she had actually written a book that's really A Place in the Woods, a first draft of it, in the 1950s. While she's doing all this magazine work, she's also telling the story of her and Aid looking for a cabin and going over to. So I had all of this stuff, and it was basically the first draft of A Place in the Woods. So she quickly pulls that out, rewrites parts of it, tightens it up, makes it better, sends it off to her publisher in about 3 months. And he goes, "What? How did you turn this book around that fast?" She never let him know that it was in the can and ready to go. They thought she was like this gifted, prolific writer that she could turn this thing around so fast. So that comes out in 1969, and then the fans just descend on her. You know, like people come up here trying to, you know, and they would drive to Grand Marais and go, "We want to go find that woman who wrote this book." And they'd say, "I'll go up the Gunflint Trail and ask one of the lodges, and they'll tell you where to go." And of course, they were all saying, "Well, yeah, the Hoovers live right over here," and they would just come in and stream. She counted up one day, and it's in the details are in the book. I think they had 167 drop-in visitors one summer. And she said groups as small as 2 and as many as 11 people. So, and she's trying to write this. What she was trying to finish this book up and doing some editing on it. And she and Aid they left town. They went to Laramie, Wyoming, and in 1968, so she could finish the book and he could finish the artwork because they just couldn't get anything done. So then, you saw that he bought the Mustang. Now they were able to leave town. They traveled into Southwest for a good part of '67 and parts of '69. Then the publisher, you know, this was very successful. Actually, one of the fun little trivia things about The Place in the Woods is that she was on the Today Show on July 3rd, 1969, with Hugh Downs and Joe Garagiola. And she was on air for 10 minutes. I mean, that's a lifetime in television these days. 10 minutes talking about this book. They couldn't go to a commercial break because Hugh Downs and Joe were just so fascinated by Aid and Helen sitting there in the studio. I've tried desperately to get the video of it. It's available, but Getty Images owns it, and they charge a small fortune to even look at it. So I've never been able to see it. My publisher tried to buy it using educational rights, and they wouldn't give them. So it's out there. I wish I knew somebody at NBC that could sneak into the vault. Anyway, of course, the publisher wants a third book. They want another Woods book. Helen's getting tired of Woods books. She's been traveling. She's very well off now. She's getting very disillusioned with the development on the trail, the interruptions, electricity, widening of the road, pesticides being used to keep the weeds down. She's not happy. And eventually they moved to New Mexico in 1970 in ranchos. They had discovered that at some point and loved it. Then that's where she wrote The Years of the Forest. She did not write any of it here in Minnesota. And for those who don't know, A Place in the Woods covers the first 2 years of them living here, finding the place, living here, adapting, and it ends with this ice house that they had on the lake catching on fire and burning, and Helen and Aid putting the fire out in early December, you know, with buckets of water and all of that. And it's sort of like, you know, after we'd been tested, we knew that we could survive after this. So the book ends. So The Years of the Forest, it's sort of easy to pick up from there and sort of talk about what happened all the next years. And she talks about her, the deer family. She sort of talks about the whole Peter and the deer family in a different sense. It's not just lifted from A Gift of the Woods, but in the context of their other life. And also just other stories of watching nature and observing things, and her writing and those sort of things. They're all spelled out there. But the second part of the book really talks about how things got dark for her and Aid with the changes on the trail. So you read this front of the book, and it's it's like the life we all want to lead. We want to quit our job and just go live in the woods and all the things that you think are positive that come with that. But in the end, she starts to talk about the hunters and the people who treated her poorly and didn't like her because she had a high IQ. And being a high IQ person up here, she didn't have great social skills, so she didn't endear herself to folks up here. I mean, she didn't suffer fools very well, and I think she felt there were a whole lot of fools living here that she didn't have time for. And I don't mean to be critical of people, but you have to understand high IQ, Chicago, metallurgist. She's not going to have a lot to say to folks at the gas pump at the lodge. It's just not going to happen. And she doesn't like hunters and fishermen, so what are you going to do? So she writes this book under duress. She wanted it to be 2 books, and her publisher said, "There's no way you're getting 2 books out of this. You're doing 1 book." And so she battled with him, and she was tired, and she just said, "I'm done. I'm going to do this, and I'm going to go try to write something else." So this fame brought all these things that I've talked about. They also traveled in the West and into Florida. And then they moved to New Mexico. And then here's one of the quirky things of Helen in her later life. Again, social skills and all this. She had started to love cats in New Mexico. And stray cats would start to show up, and they'd feed them. Feeding deer, feeding cats. There's these things there. And then, of course, when you feed cats and do that, cats are like rabbits. And there's a lot more cats. And the city of Laramie had a cat problem in general, but the Hoovers created an even bigger cat problem, and they created a new ordinance that didn't allow any cats to not have leashes or collars. And Helen went into a tailspin about that. She started invoking the Fourth Amendment, false seizure, and all this stuff. And so she had remembered going to Laramie, Wyoming, to finish up A Gift of the Deer, and there was a woman there who ran a motel that she liked because the woman left her alone and let her write and not bother her. So she called her up on the phone and said, "Edna, I need a house. I'm flying up to Laramie. Find me a real estate agent because I got to get all these cats out of Laramie." So she flies up there, and she what?
Out of New Mexico.
Out of New Mexico. I'm sorry, out of New Mexico, not out of Laramie. So she's in Laramie. She finds this house, buys it. They move all the cats up in a car. They change houses, and then she hires a local guy to build a $15,000 cat house. Sorry, a cattery. She called it a cat house, but a cattery. And she had probably 40 cats. And it got to be kind of a strange obsession for her from about 1977 through 84 when she died. So she was like this, kind of strange cat lady that lived out of downtown Laramie, out in the rural area, and and for all the years that she hated snowmobiles, they had a snowmobile because they used one to go from the main road to the cabin because they didn't have anybody plow the driveway. So Aid would go back and forth on a snowmobile. I thought that was kind of interesting. My battery must have died. It did die.
There you go.
Oh, good. So I talked about the cats. Her age, her health. She really never really recovered from that car accident in '54 in terms of knees and ankles. The other thing is she gained a lot of weight over the years. She was very obese at the time. And, I kind of assumed that looking at pictures, but, you don't want to be judgmental about pictures. But this Edna Moxley wrote to a previous person who was going to attempt a biography on Helen, who I was able to get her research and her papers. And she had written to this woman very gently saying, in the end, Helen was really a large woman, I would say probably obese, and didn't get out much. So when you put all these factors together, you can see why she was rather homebound, probably. The cats kept her entertained, but she died from peritonitis at age 74. And if you know anything about peritonitis, it's a very curable infection. It's not something that's necessarily deadly. So she obviously wasn't paying attention or taking care of herself. And then Abe lived for 2 more years and died at 86. That's their pictures at the end. These are great pictures. I like them. They were for a passport. You know, they always thought they would travel overseas, but Helen was afraid of flying. Her agent tried to convince her to take a cruise. The Queen Mary to London, and but so they had these pictures taken. This was 1977 when they were in New Mexico, and but I thought, you know, they're nice portraits. You know, they look like great shots. Some of the other pictures of her. So let's talk about her legacy for a minute. You know, I talked about her as being a metallurgist. She was really a trailblazer there, and that, you know, women that were successful back in those days were really overlooked. And it mentioned that she was a metallurgist in her obituary in the New York Times, but it really focused on her success as an author. But when you look at it, I mean, 2 patents and solving this big problem for International Harvester, you know, that's to me just as important as her writing career. She always carried this message about man cannot, you know, manage nature but live in balance with it. And, you know, she tried to do that. People accused her when she fed the animals of sort of violating that by, you know, domesticating them and falsely getting them comfortable with humans. But she didn't look at it that way. She let them do their thing, and she was well aware of that whole sort of balance that you needed to be careful about. And I think, unfortunately, it was brought home to her, you know, when the hunting happened. So the nice thing is all of her books are still in print. In fact, all 4 of them, and one of her children's books that was reprinted by the University of Minnesota Press are up at the bookstore. So you can get all 4 of them today if you so like to do that. And I think, again, what I talked about earlier about nature writers is it's timeless. I mean, her writing still appeals today. I've read her books like 8 times doing the research, because, you know, when you're writing a biography, you're looking for things between the lines that might inform you about somebody's life. So I've read them, but every time I read them, I find something new or fresh, or, oh yeah, she had a nice way of saying that. So she really was, she really is, I mean, still the nature writing really holds up well. You know, Sigurd Olson's books are still popular and people read them. So again, it gets back to that notion that nature doesn't go out of style. So there's that. Any questions or? Yeah. So my wife and I had a good friend of ours who had a cabin that we used to visit, and then we decided we needed to get our own. This is back in 2000. And she gave us a copy of A Place in the Woods, because she said, as you're looking for a cabin and you'll get one, you're going to encounter all these foibles, you know, all the things that happen that you don't think about. And I read it, thought it was charming. I'm not more than charming. I thought it was, well, this is interesting. She must have written some other things. I read the other 3 books of hers. And as I want to do when I am interested in an author, I said, there's got to be a biography. I had just finished reading Sigurd Olson's biography by David Backus, A Wilderness Within. It was a great book, and I thought that gave me a lot of insight into how, you know, the struggles that Sigurd Olson had as a writer. So I thought there must be an interesting book about this Helen Hoover. And I didn't find one, although I did find this little master's thesis that was about 30 pages that a woman named Florence Carr had written for her MFA in creative writing at Hamlin. And she had tried to publish a biography, but it wasn't strong enough, and she was in her 60s when she wrote this. So she really wasn't, I think, up for trying to get it really published. But she gave the Minnesota Historical Society a copy of this, and I had pulled it out, read it, and was even more fascinated. That had more about the metallurgy part. And then found out that that's because it was footnoted that all of Helen's papers were at UMD, which I had no idea. So I made an appointment to go up to UMD and poke around, and there's 23 boxes of stuff. And I just said, this is fascinating. I mean, there's a book here. And it took me many years to get to the book, but because of work and some other commitments, but that's kind of what triggered it. So I guess I got a little obsessive compulsive about Helen. There's somebody in the back there. Yeah.
What happened to the cabin?
The cabin?
Yeah.
The summer cabin was torn down. There's another cabin. The winter cabin is still there. It's owned by a family. It's been added onto and modified and has running water. It doesn't, obviously, it resembles on the outside the way it did back then, but on the inside, it not at all. I've been in it. I've slept in it one night. I was given the luxury by the owners to stay there one night. Actually, it was the night before I was up here. If anybody saw me talk in 2019, I was here. The Ettinger said, would you like to stay in the Hoover cabin tonight? And I went, oh my God. I never wanted to ask. I never thought it was appropriate to ask. So they volunteered that, and I was very grateful for them to do that. So yeah, it stands. Yes.
They had no children?
No children. She did have a miscarriage in 1940, somewhere right after World War II. Interestingly, was sick with something else before when they moved. Her mother had a heart attack and was in the hospital.
Oh.
Then she learns that she was pregnant, and she's got husband and mother in 2 different hospitals. Almost has a nervous breakdown, and then has a miscarriage. Yeah, but she would have been in her late 38 or 39 at that time for her first pregnancy. So, yeah. Yes, sir.
Any anecdotes or information you were able to gather about her from other folks around here that were concurrent with
Oh,
her?
yeah. We're the Gilmore daughters. So Orv Gilmore and his wife bought, let's see, let me get this right, the summer cabin, right? So, and the Hoovers, had sold it to them. And or was it the Hoovers or did somebody else sell it? It was the Hoovers. I get the Gilmores and the Reynolds mixed up. So anyway, John Henriksen, who many of you may know, was I wrote many things about Gunflint Trail. I met him early on, as one would expect on writing about Helen Hoover. He had always wanted to write a Helen Hoover biography and had accumulated papers, but he never knew about the UMD papers, so he could only find out so much stuff. So I come knocking one day, and as all the locals up here called the Hoover fans, they call us pilgrims. And not necessarily politely. So John Henderson said, well, here's another pilgrim showing up at my door thinking he's going to do something about Helen Hoover. Well, I was the guy that was going to do something about Helen Hoover. And so we got to know each other very well, and I visited him several times along with Charlene Letourneau, who he introduced me to, and because she was at Heston's. And so I learned a lot of anecdotal things from those two, but the one Orv Gilmore story that's funny, and I just told his daughter about it because I just met her today for the first time, is when Orv wrote to John saying, when are you going to do the Hoover biography? And he writes back and says, I'm not doing it. There's this young man named David, and he's going to do it, and I want you to talk to him at some point, and I'll give him your contact info. So anyway, I get these papers when John decides he's not going to do it, and it's got the Orv Gilmore letter back to John Henriksen. He said, John, that Helen Hoover made up everything she wrote. None of it is true. It's just all fiction, blah, 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 blah. And I had heard that. I had heard that from other people up here. I think one of the people that said that most, bless his soul, was Bruce Kerfoot. I don't think he thought she wrote a word of any of it, thought she made it all up. And of course, they probably locked horns about hunting and fishing anyway, so let's just leave it at that. And I had tried to talk to Bruce Kerfoot many years ago about Helen, but he didn't want to talk about it. So I never really got his impressions on that. But I have talked to his widow, Sue. She's been in touch with me about it because she's doing a history up here. Anyway, I thought the Orv Gilmore letter was great because I had heard this all secondhand over the years, but I needed to have a verifiable source for it. So I said, now I've got a letter with a date on it from Orv Gilmore, John Henderson. It's a footnote in the book. So if you read it closely, you'll see that. Some of the other things Orv said in that same letter, he said, there was one time when me and another guy, I can't remember his name, were moving a heavy piece of equipment that they donated to the Hoovers because they were, I think it might have been a gas-fired refrigerator or a washing machine. Anyways, they were dragging it into the house and they dragged it over a bunch of ferns, and Helen went ballistic that they had trampled her ferns. And of course, if you're over at our property, there are ferns all over. So what's the deal with these ferns right here? But they just lay it into these guys. She just laid into them about destroying her ferns. So she didn't like gossip. She hated the gossip, the trail gossip, the moccasin talk, moccasin wire talk. I think again it was because she was intellectual. She didn't like trafficking and that sort of. She thought there was just too much incessant, grousing about, people grousing about other people. She felt like that people played them for fools, because there's one thing I didn't put in the book, but it's interesting that somebody had given them a birthday cake or something, just because it was somebody's birthday. And when Helen cut into it, it was all moldy and it was all, so she just thought that was something done out of spite rather than maybe an honest mistake. So there was little things like that I picked up on, and I extracted all those from correspondence that she wrote. And a couple of the other things, observations that she, if you read her books, they make it sound like that living up here wasn't that bad. I mean, it has challenges, but she wrote to her publisher about the very last book, The Years of the Forest, and she had written about how things were difficult for them, but she laid into him one day about something, and she said, Angus, you don't know how difficult it is to live here. She said, when you can't eat and you're hungry, and what you rely on is like pancakes and brown sugar and all this carbs for a living, and then what that does and she said, and how that affects you mentally and how it affects your body chemistry, and you just have this sort of hair trigger anger that comes forward. She said that's difficult living. And it was interesting because I didn't really dive into a lot of that in the book, but it was revealing that it was much more difficult than she wrote about. And I think part of that is, do the readers really want to read that? I don't think so. And after her first book, or after The Gift of the Deer and the huge amount of fan mail that she got, I think she realized that her readers wanted a certain type of story from her, and certainly her publisher did, because they kept saying, we need another woods book, and she was done with writing about the woods, and especially after she moved away, she couldn't, because she couldn't write about what she saw. So I hope that helped answer that for you. Good.
Very good.
Anybody else? Yes, back there.
What about the children's books? How did they come
Oh, that's
about?
great. Thanks for asking about that, because I really don't talk about that, and maybe I'll add a slide about that. So the Humpty Dumpty's columns that she did, 2 of them were compilations of those columns. And her editor, Elvin Tressel, came out here from New York because he just thought she was an interesting character. And they had a great correspondence because he was very intellectual, and she could write to him and relate to him on a much higher. I mean, they talk politics, they talk about nuclear war. Helen would complain about the SAC jets that flew over, Strategic Air Command used to run planes all over up here. And what was it that they dropped, like foil or something? There was foil residue that was around here or something. I don't know. She talked about all of this stuff that I hadn't heard about. Anyway, so he wanted to visit her so they could do the final edits on the book. And he came out here. He stayed in the summer cabin, because later on they started to rent the summer cabin out to make some money. And she played a minuet on her baby grand, and a bear came over to the cabin and almost broke into it one night. So he got the full-on experience of Helen Hoover, from wild animals knocking down my door to sitting outside while Helen plays a Beethoven minuet on her baby grand piano. But then the one book that was most popular, and that, well, I shouldn't say most popular, but that was more mainstream, was the one that they have up here, The Great Wolf and the Good Woodsman, which is kind of a parable. And the latest version of it is a Betsy Bowen woodcut version that the University of Minnesota Press redid, and it's just beautiful. But the original one was done, and there's a copy of it in the display case up here at the museum. So when you go in the back corner in the Chik-Wauk, you'll see the original Great Wolf and Good Woodsman. It's a really beautiful book, sort of an abstract Russian arabesque type rendering that was very popular at that time in the mid-60s, kind of the mod mid-60s. So it's a very interesting book by itself. So that one sold quite well. The other thing about The Gift of the Deer that I didn't talk about, even though it was written for the adult market, it really sold in well with the juvenile market, and many schools used it as a teaching, environmental teaching sort of story. So she was really proud of the fact that she got a lot of fan mail from students that would send her. The teacher would send a letter, and then there'd be like 10, Mrs. Hoover, we love that you fed Peter and all this, and she just thrilled on that, because to her, teaching the next generation about the importance of treating animals well was really what she was all about. So, yeah. Any others?
Great.
Great, thank you.